I'll hand things over to our Commissioner-designate now, but I'm looking forward to taking your questions in a few minutes. Thank you all. Commissioner Lucki.
Brenda Lucki's appointment as Commissioner of the RCMP. It was a real moment for Canada. She was the first woman ever to take on that role, and her job transformed the force, make history, make change, modernize the institution. But the last 5 years have been a real test of her and her organization's resolve, its ability to perform and adapt.
The Minister and the Commissioner lied and violated the independence of the RCMP and jeopardized the investigation into the worst mass killing in Canadian history. We do not have confidence in this Minister to hold any position in this government, and he should resign immediately along with the RCMP Commissioner.
And last week, a brief statement where Brenda Lucki said this: "Today, I announced that I have made a personal decision to retire."
A historic first step, and again, she deserves to be thanked for her service.
I'm Andrew Chang. Today on About That, why is Brenda Lucki stepping down? It's fair to say RCMP Commissioner Brenda Lucki's tenure started about as badly as it possibly could have.
Very grateful to the men and women who have guided me, mentored me, and believed in me, and who have forged the path to this very special day.
I have no update on the members. I think they're doing fine. From what I know, they were taken care of, and we're taking all the precautions and the necessary steps that we have to make sure that they're okay.
And let's not forget, the RCMP was already a mess when she took the job.
To all the women who have been impacted by the force's failure to have protected your experience at work, we hurt you. For that, I'm truly sorry.
It goes without saying, for Lucki, expectations were high. When she was first appointed, she vowed to rid the force of its toxic workplace culture, something that had been deeply ingrained over decades.
Constantly members yelling at you, screaming at you, talking down to you, coming behind you, grabbing you.
Unwanted sexual touching, assaults, filthy jokes, and bullying are among the nearly 400 complaints they say prove the problem is systemic.
The sexual assaults, the inadvertent tearing my top open and reaching in and grasping me by my breast, things like that. There's so many. You could go on and on and on.
It's only together that we will continue to work towards a modern police service.
But in June of 2020, Canada would get a clear view of just how much modernizing the force needed to do. We saw dashcam footage of police tackling, punching, and arresting Chief Alan Adam of the Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation. Chief Adam and his wife were leaving a casino when he was pulled over for having an expired license plate. A few minutes go by, the tone of the encounter seems to become more confrontational. At one point, Adam takes off his jacket. At another, the encounter gets physical as one of the officers lays hands on Adam's wife and he intervenes. Finally, the whole situation boils over, with Adam being tackled to the ground, even punched while down. He would be arrested and charged with resisting arrest and assaulting an officer. Now today, we have the benefit of seeing the dashcam footage, but before the footage was made public, the RCMP said, "No, we've done a review and we don't think the officers did anything wrong." Once Canadians saw the footage though, there was outrage, and very quickly the charges against Chief Adam were dropped. But that's not all. We also found out that the officer who tackled him was himself at the time awaiting trial on assault charges, but he was cleared to work, obviously. This was bad. It made national headlines.
New video showing the arrest of a First Nation chief by the RCMP seems to be having an impact.
We have all now seen the shocking video of Chief Adam's arrest, and we must get to the bottom of this.
And this idea that the RCMP was stuck in its ways, like, was it even aware it had a discrimination problem? This would trip up Brenda Lucki again and again. She once told the Globe and Mail, if systemic racism is meaning that racism is entrenched in our policies and procedures, I would say that we don't have systemic racism.
Do you believe that there is systemic racism inside police organizations, including yours in the country?
That is an interesting question, because in the last couple of days, I've honestly heard about 15 or 20 definitions of systemic racism.
She must have settled on one of those definitions, because eventually she came to this realization. In a statement released in June 2020, Lucki said, I do know that systemic racism is part of every institution, the RCMP included. But within hours of issuing that statement, there would be another violent confrontation, this time involving a Mi'kmaq man from New Brunswick, Rodney Levi, shot to death by an RCMP officer. That same year, a petition would circulate calling for Brenda Lucki's resignation.
I have confidence in Commissioner Lucki, and the work that we're going to be doing together in the coming months is going to make a huge difference in combating systemic racism and reducing it in this country.
It would have been hard to gauge just how long that confidence would last, especially with one of the most challenging chapters of recent RCMP history still to come. A mass murderer dressed as an RCMP officer on a killing rampage that lasted 13 hours. He would kill 22 people, and Nova Scotia RCMP seemed at a loss. They couldn't explain why it took 12 hours to tell the public that the killer was disguised as one of them, or why they had given the public so little warning at all that a killer was even on the loose.
To watch what happened last week, to watch the media chew us up, eat us up, and spit us out, and to watch to hear what the minister and the prime minister had to say about the RCMP's inability to communicate, I will never forget it, because I know we're better than that.
Now, it's possible this whole episode could have gone by without Brenda Lucki herself becoming so directly, personally, and publicly accountable. But she was accused of using the opportunity to play politics. She was heard on a recording, angry that Nova Scotia investigators hadn't released any information on what guns the killer used. Apparently, she had told the Prime Minister they'd make that public, which would have been useful as they were pushing their new gun control legislation, Bill C-21.
Does anybody realize what's going on in the world of handguns and guns right now? The fact that they're in the middle of trying to get a legislation going. I'm waiting for the Prime Minister to call me so I can apologize.
By her own admission, Lucki dropped the ball. And clearly, others thought so too. There were more calls for her to step down.
I'm truly sorry that we failed you. I promise that we'll do better.
Up until this point, Lucki's tenure had been both painful and punishing. The RCMP's image was taking a beating. And think of what morale must have been like for the 20,000 officers across the country who still wore the uniform, still did the job. The force, under Lucki's leadership, was being criticized for how it handled Indigenous-led protests against natural gas pipelines. A federal judge ruled she had failed to respond quickly enough to a watchdog report about alleged RCMP spying on anti-oil protesters. And there was this. As convoy protesters took control of Ottawa's downtown core, and as patience wore thin,
time to go home! Time to go home!
Got a problem with nobody wanting to make decisions, nobody wanting to come forward and actually act.
I've been at protests where people got kicked off of Parliament Hill for having a stick to have a placard on it, right?
If the police have a strategy, it sure as heck isn't obvious to us.
Lucki would again be put under intense scrutiny. You'll recall, the protest went on for a few weeks before the Prime Minister invoked the Emergencies Act. Now, this gave Ottawa and police sweeping powers to seize vehicles and property, freeze assets, even legally prevent people from coming to the protest site at all. It's a pretty extraordinary lever to pull.
It's not something to be undertaken lightly.
This wasn't something we were eager to do.
It's also a measure of last resort, only to be used when a national emergency cannot be effectively dealt with under any other law of Canada. But Lucki testified at an inquiry that the RCMP had a plan to end the occupation and that she believed invoking the Emergencies Act wasn't necessary. But she neglected to actually say that at cabinet meetings before the act was invoked.
Your messages don't get delivered to cabinet when they then deliberate on the invocation of the act. Do you appreciate the significance of that scenario?
Yes and no, because we had spoken about the fact that we had an integrated planning cell, that we were bringing together a plan. I guess in hindsight, yeah, that might have been something significant. Honestly, there was so much information going back and forth.
Lucki would later be described by Canada's top civil servant as a wounded leader. And while Lucki says her retirement was a personal decision, it's always hard to know, right, in any field, whether someone is truly leaving of their own volition or whether they've been encouraged to leave. She does say this, however. This was not an easy decision, as I love the RCMP and have loved being the 24th Commissioner. Among her final words, I did my best. Now we're going to take a quick commercial break, but in just a couple of minutes, we're going to bring in our Ottawa reporter, because what I really want to know on this story is, was Brenda Lucki pushed out? Back after this.
It is unfortunate. It was undesirable. We didn't want to do it. But we'd gotten to a place where there was no other choice to keep Canadians safe, we felt, than to do this, and that's what we did. And indeed, the Commissioner found that, yes, we met that very high bar. There should be a very high bar for invoking the Emergencies Act, and we hit that.
Hey there, welcome back to About That. So look, here's where we're at. We've been spending the episode talking about RCMP Commissioner Brenda Lucki's personal decision to retire as commissioner, but boy, oh boy, do I still have questions, about how that decision might have come to be. So joining us right now to talk about that, we have Catherine Tunney, who's a reporter in our Parliamentary Bureau in Ottawa. And Catherine, I'm so glad you're here because you have done so much of our reporting on, not just the RCMP and Brenda Lucki, but also on the Emergencies Act inquiry that's been unfolding. Thanks for being here. How are you doing?
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no, hey, thanks for being here. So for as long, and you tell me if I'm wrong, like for as long as I can remember, and maybe as long as Commissioner Lucki has been in this post, I feel like there have been calls for her to resign, but how much pressure would she genuinely have been sort of facing and feeling in the lead up to the announcement to retire?
Well, no, you're absolutely right. And as recently as November, Brenda Lucki was very adamant that she was going to stay in the job.
The RCMP and you personally have had a difficult few years. Today, Alberta's Justice Minister issued a statement saying that province has lost confidence in you and they're calling for your removal. How do you respond to that?
Well, I'm not going to comment directly on that. I'm not going to step down from my position.
So obviously something changed when she, as of last week, when she announced that she was going to retire. Being the commissioner is a really hard job. Lots of commissioners have, also faced calls for their resignation. But I think, for all the reasons that you just ran through, Brenda Lucki has had a tough couple of years, basically tough since day one as being the commissioner. And while she might not have been seen as, an irritant, she was definitely seen, for my understanding, as a lacking commissioner, somewhat of a disappointing commissioner, and that sometimes, led to calls for her resignation. So it's hard not to see all of that kind of building up to last week's decision.
But okay, and tell me a little bit more about that sentiment, because we've seen over the years Justin Trudeau and other ministers sort of, appear to be firmly behind her and supportive of her. And I can't help but wonder that as we kind of got closer and closer to this moment, whether any of that confidence in Lucki had shifted. Like, do we know whether Justin Trudeau, for example, wanted her to stay or to step down?
Yeah, so I mean, we can only really base it on what we know from their public comments. And, the Prime Minister, along with Public Safety Minister Marco Mendicino, always said, no, we have confidence her when they were asked about, the various calls for her to step down.
The Alberta government wants Lucki fired. It says she's failed to meet what it calls the most meager standards as head of the RCMP. The federal government says it has confidence in Lucki. The Public Safety Minister says he's not firing her.
There will be obviously a discussion with the commissioner as her current defined term comes to its natural conclusion, and we'll see where that takes us.
Now, we know kind of behind the scenes, talking to sources, that the time was up for her, and maybe this was a chance to let her go with her head held high, that her term was not going to be renewed. I also know, talking to Mendicino, for example, that in one breath he would say, I have confidence in her, and in the other breath say, at the same time, I wish things were happening more quickly. She was tasked with this pretty incredible modernization, really kind of trying to turn this giant organization around mandate, including a mandate letter that had some very clear do this type of things that maybe perhaps were not being ticked off as quickly as the government wanted.
And one more question for you, Catherine, about the timing of all of this, because I mean, it would be easy to look at the timing of the decision to retire and think that it's a bit I don't even know what the right, fishy, maybe, given that, I mean, the announcement comes just days before the Emergencies Act, inquiry report comes out, not too long before the Mass Casualty Commission, report is scheduled to release about the Nova Scotia shootings, and neither of which, she may have thought would reflect well on her leadership. So what's your sense there?
Yeah, I mean, the decision definitely raised eyebrows at the time, continues to do so. What's interesting is that now that we have the report and have read, the 2,000 pages that are in it, Commissioner Rouleau had a lot of, firm words for how police responded, but not necessarily for the RCMP. It was mainly at the Ottawa Police. And actually that whole issue of, Brenda Lucki, why she didn't raise that, she thought police could have handled the situations without the Emergencies Act, but she didn't raise that in that meeting. He kind of says, it probably would not have made a difference. So it's actually not quite as damning, and maybe, you wouldn't say, she has to, resign or retire after reading that report. However, next month, we'll get the report out of the Nova Scotia mass shooting.
Commission Council calls Brenda Lucki the Commissioner of the RCMP.
In her testimony, Brenda Lucki called the massacre that started in Portapique a turning point, where residents lost faith in the Mounties and morale spiraled in the ranks.
I think they're thinking about the effect of what happened and the negative narrative that resulted, and Canadians losing trust in their local RCMP.
Lots of questions for the RCMP and how they handled that, and it's pretty hard to see how they can escape that without a lot of criticism. So, there's still, another report that I think will be attached to her legacy and, does not paint a pretty picture.
All right. Catherine Tunney, always good to talk to you. Thank you so much for doing this. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.